Muchas gracias, Javier. Hola, hola, hola a todos and buenos tardes. I will be talking about Stan Grof's discovery and the multiple confirmations that now coming from different angles. It's let me see. This is Stan at 90, and I think you all probably have seen this frequently quoted statement about monitoring states of consciousness. In this case, because his major discoveries were enabled by using psychedelics. Holotropic breathwork came later when when the psychedelics were not legal. And the whole talk is really going to be revolving around an issue that is relevant, very central, I think, to psychedelic work and holotropic breath work, and that's the question of consciousness. You know, where these extraordinary, rich experiences are actually coming from, and what the mainstream thinks about it, and what Stan has actually discovered about these issues. So, from my point of view, the kind of five important contributions by Stan have been the expanded cartography, a role of inner healer, the different therapeutic approach as a support rather than interpretations from the therapist's mind, of course, the discovery of holotropic breath work and the importance of sudden setting. But I think the central one, I think, is really the expanded cartography. That was the greatest breakthrough, and that was the most, and probably still remains the most debated and most often opposed by the mainstream psychology and psychiatry. So I'll focus on that. I think what he showed very clearly, that the ideas of Freud, that we only have memories up to early childhood and then some memories in unconscious until the birth, was clearly insufficient. There's much more to human memory and ability to experience things. And even his discovery, I think, of the expanded map of consciousness has gone beyond Jung, because Jung still essentially saw the collective unconscious as primarily applying to humans. I think we are focused particularly on what now supports this main discovery that he has made. Expanding map, and we also need to talk about the concept that supports it. So, as you know, sadly, the current dominant explanation of the nature of consciousness is still, this is coming from the brain. Now, people formulate it in a number of different ways, but essentially, this is the idea that somehow the neuronal networks in some unknown process create a consciousness. But unfortunately, this is definitely either incomplete or wrong explanation. And there are several missing pieces that clearly support Stan's approach and Stan's finding. First of all, I should mention we've looked for the source of experiences in the brain for close to 60 years. Could not find any, and I'll summarize that very briefly. But there are other missing pieces. For example, the observations from near-death experiences that Am I going too fast? Is it okay for the translator? Yeah. So the other observations and experimental findings, and I will primarily focus on only on the things that have been well documented experimentally. So one of them is, of course, near-death experiences that have been particularly studied by cardiologists with people on the operating table, and shows clearly that some kind of consciousness continues when the brain is gone. The other major area, of course, is the findings in the body, showing, and we'll touch on that very briefly, that there is some consciousness stored in the body tissues, and of course from holotropic breath work and psychedelic work, we know that there is how much is you have to deal with during the sessions in the body if you want to reach some experiences. The other area that experimental area that cannot be explained, the consciousness activities, is of course the psi, the experiences such as telepathy, remote viewing, remote hearing, precognition, and so on. I will only, the best documented is of course remote viewing, so I will focus only on that, just to stay with well experimentally documented observations. And at the end, I would like to just offer a perspective that comes together from Stan's and my own work. It was interesting to get to this point, because when we started, we came to the Psychiatric Research Institute in Prague, essentially almost in the same year. And it was an interesting situation. There are always some advantages when you come from left political side or right political side. And at that time, of course, it was a communist government, but they happened to have a good idea to set up a research institute in Prague for the country. And the other part of the communist situation was they were completely incompetent about building and creating things in that setup. And so you really had to have an accommodation in Prague if you wanted to work in the institute. So they were desperately looking for people who could work there. And so both of us, although we were politically unacceptable and eliminated from any academic work, because of this situation, they took us into the institute. And Stan had the option, he went first, and he became part of the psychotherapeutic group that decided to use the newest tool, which was LSD at that time, and the unusual observations that it can have important therapeutic effects in situations where nothing else worked. I, on the other hand, with our Freudian background, came as the first person. There was a chair. It was a chair of child psychiatry, and I was supposed to be the first psychiatrist working on it because I spent quite a bit of training in child psychiatry. Now, what that happened was that the director of the new director was voted in. Was not supported by the head of child psychiatry. So the new director just kicked him out and canceled child psychiatry and gave me a choice, either to leave the institute, which at that time would have meant I would have to go somewhere in the boonies as a dentist, or to take psychopharmacology as a fellowship. So I decided to go in psychopharmacology. And of course, so we were on 2 floors in the institute, and one was essentially based on the idea that everything has kind of psychological, psychosocial genesis, and that where Stern was, and I was in a part that assumed, of course, that all psychiatric problems are neurobiological. And so I got a training, and I continued searching in the brain, and I'll show you very briefly the interesting summary that emerged out of kind of almost 60 years of searching for the neurobiological sources of consciousness. And interestingly, at the end, we realized that we ended up with essentially the same finding, just supported from 2 different directions. And I have, from the neurobiological work, there is some addition to Stan's concept that I will mention briefly at the end. The fact that essentially, to sum up, that the experiences cannot be created in the brain according to the available evidence. But we did find that brain has some contributions, and I'll touch on it briefly. So clearly, if you talk about something like consciousness or anything, it's good to have a definition. But you will not find a definition anywhere in the literature that people would agree on. You have different definitions if you are, let's say, neurologist or neurophysiologist, because then your definition is that consciousness is something that creates, it's a process that leads from neurons to creating the mind. But of course, psychologists believe completely that these are the psychological processes in the brain. Philosophers have a variety of things. And my assumption is, when I've worked on this, is that our human experiences are so rich, particularly when it comes also to non-ordinary states of consciousness and things that you experience during holotropic breath work, during psychedelics, for example. They are so rich that people tend to then focus on their particular type of experience and try to explain everything by that. And I felt we really cannot talk about these things without some definition. So I at least will offer the definitions that we created for the ordinary and non-ordinary consciousness. And you will see the differences when I briefly review the different theories of consciousness. So, ordinary consciousness is something that we all know, and this is the huge paradox, because ordinary consciousness is with us from the morning, from the time we wake up until we fall asleep, and during the night. This, of course, consciousness continues, at least in the form of dreams, but it is something that it remains a mystery. There's no agreed on explanation where this comes from. If NASA has sent probes, planetary probes, way beyond billions of kilometers, way beyond the planetary system. We know about 212 subatomic particles. So we are far and deep in the reality. But what is so familiar to us every day, we still don't understand. So the ordinary consciousness is primarily self-awareness. And there's a lot of discussion about what creates self, but it's a feeling that I am experiencing it, me, not you, not that somebody else. The other part of ordinary consciousness is, of course, all the perceptions that you have from external environments through eyes, ears, taste, skin, and so on. And of course, internal experience is particularly if you're not well, then you become very acutely aware of the internal conditions. The other factors that are often not mentioned but are very important is time that we perceive as linear and space as three-dimensional. And for you who probably already have experienced some non-ordinary states, this may be self-evident, but for most people, if I would talk about this, they would be wondering, why are you mentioning time? Isn't it linear? Well, it turns out that's really something that's a construction in the brain, in the mind, in some way, and it can or cannot be there, depending whether you are in ordinary consciousness or non-ordinary consciousness. And I will talk about some of the neurobiological work. You can simply, when you become depressed, for example, the time slows. And if you try to measure what is 10 seconds, the depressed person will count 40 seconds or 14 seconds or 15 seconds. If you're manic and the mind is speeded up, you will actually experience time. If I give you a task to tell me when 10 seconds passes, for you it will be done by 5 or 6 or 7 seconds. So it's not, time remains actually a mystery for modern physics. Time is a mystery. So part of ordinary consciousness is that we feel that time progresses linear. Minute, second, minute after minute, hour after hour. And the same thing is with space. This is not the three-dimensionality that we feel, that space is up and down, right and left, close and far. This is also somehow created in the mind, because there are situations that in ordinary states where that even in the dreams, I think it's sometimes difficult to describe very clearly the three dimensions. Now, that's the ordinary consciousness. The non-ordinary consciousness is tricky, because we can really at this point define it only by what's missing there, what is changing from ordinary consciousness. The sense of self starts weakening and may eventually disappear. If you, for example, have intense ketamine experience, eventually you watch it, you experience it, but it's not, you don't necessarily tie it with yourself. Personal history can be disrupted. You probably already had some non-ordinary experiences in holotropic breathwork or psychedelics, so you know what I'm talking about. You stop suddenly feeling the close connection with your life has started from birth. That history starts losing meaning. You don't identify yourself necessarily with the physical and psychological existence. And I have already touched on that in a way. The time linearity starts weakening, can be speeded up, slowed down. And if you get into the mystical experiences, then you are in timelessness, you are in eternity. And space also is very different in ordinary states. So I felt, while nobody agrees on any definition of consciousness, we should at least have these two concepts mentioned. Where we are? Yeah. How does this dominant concept? How did that start? Now, people have been thinking about mind, about consciousness for 2,500 years. This idea that consciousness is created in the brain really was mostly formed 200 years ago by a neuroanatomist who was initially working in Vienna, in Austria. And he was accomplished neuroanatomist. I mean, some of the discoveries of neuroanatomical tracts are still in the modern textbooks on neuroanatomy. He was examining brains of both people who had severe brain disorders and also brain healthy people who died, and comparing it. And he came up with two interesting conclusions. One was, number one, mind is brain and brain is mind. There's nothing else involved. And the other point was, there are different parts of the brain that have different functions. And what if you take medicine or now even psychology and some other areas, you will be learning about the primary brain regions. You know that the frontal lobe is primarily the executive functions, organization, and so motor cortex, or of course motor cortex is related with movement, occipital with vision, temporal lobe with hearing, and so on, cerebral with coordination. And this is the main story. Right from the beginning, there was disagreement because people said this does not quite make sense. There's a lot of situations where the different parts of the brain need to work together. The whole white matter in the brain may work together. And that discussion for 200 years has not been quite resolved. And the present kind of perception is that it depends. Brain sometimes works and you can use this in neurology for diagnosis and so on. And you can confirm it, for example, if you're gonna do brain imaging and somebody will be moving their arm or leg, you will see the changes in motor cortex in this area. On the other hand, there's a lot of studies of neuroprotection, and it turns out that you can actually replace function from one area to the other by special procedures. And if you remember, if you've had some of the experiences in non-ordinary states, this does not quite work. You may be able to, for example, see the music, or you could hear the color, or you can look at the tree, but in fact you will start hearing the tree talking to you. And this is now, you will see when I show you the pictures of the brain in non-ordinary states of consciousness, this is different. These parts start working together. So it depends. Both are possible. So I guess answer this. Now, let me just very briefly, and don't get kind of overpowered by the slides. All I want to say is that when you talk to neuroscientists, they try to look for different parts of the brain as a source of consciousness. And as you can see, they have come with different areas based essentially on the assumption that human consciousness is kind of akin to neuronal network interactions in the brain, and that's somehow, in some unknown, unclear way, creates the consciousness. Probably the best justified ones were some of the findings in reticular activation formation, and this is because there are well-documented, there's probably more than that, but I'm aware of over 500 cases or situations where children are born essentially with only the brainstem where the reticular formation is, because this area monitors and is essential for all vital functions, breathing, heart, and so on. There are children born where this is all missing, and they have normal psychological functions. So how could you explain consciousness from these areas as psychologists do? There's about 22 psychological theories at this point explaining consciousness. These are the 4 leading ones. But again, they all, I could go through it individually. You may actually know it better than I do. They presume that some of these parts of the brain are involved in, and they, for example, I think the global workspace assumes particularly frontal and occipital areas involved, and each of the neuropsychological theories has some more favorite parts of the brain. They don't agree on solutions, and Tononis, the integrated information, has been recently attacked by a number of neuropsychologists as false and pseudoscience. That's what they say. So they are all important. They are all important for our understanding how the cognitive processes work in the brain, how the perception, how the thinking functions in the brain. But they do not explain to us where the consciousness comes from. They are not sufficient for that. Then there are a number of theories based on quantum physics. And I've pulled out there's probably about 8 of them. I've only mentioned 2 leading ones. This one, Penrose and Hameroff. Penrose is a Nobel Prize, Nobel Award recipient, and created very interesting theory of consciousness related to the microtubules in the brain neurons. Kepler, on the other hand, is another quantum physicist who assumes that consciousness is taking place completely outside of the brain, particularly in the vacuum areas. But again, they do not fully explain the consciousness. So there is a number of theories helpful. Some of them now have experimental evidence for parts of the theories. It turns out that actually what some of the basic ideas of quantum physics, the wave that collapses and is presumably connected with conscious action, it can actually take place in the brain even in those unusual situations, but doesn't seem that it necessarily explains consciousness. And then there are some theories that we will be more interested, because they do accept that consciousness is non-local, that it's not brain limited, certainly. But they are all pretty fuzzy, pretty abstract, without any clear documentation. And we could go over the details, but because it doesn't explain what we see in holotropic breathwork and in psychedelic work, I'm not going to go into details. And then there is a large number of other theories that, again, accept non-local consciousness, but are all pretty speculative. Well, what I think is is interesting is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are other experimentally well-documented observations that show that there is more consciousness, more to consciousness than just the brain. And there is now over 70 studies of near-death experiences. By near-death, what we mean is there's a clinical death documented. I'm not going to go over the clinical definitions. Essentially, the primary issue is the stoppage of the blood flow, but you of course see it because the heart stops, breathing stops, electroencephalography stops, there's no evidence in the brain. Now, different tissues in the body can survive that for a longer period of time. Brain cannot. Brain, if you don't give brain the oxygen for between 5 to 10 minutes, usually, it's irreparable. You can keep the person going on the machines, but they will not become conscious again. So, up until 1960s, when you had, let's say, myocardial infarction or stroke, it was difficult to revitalize the person. Then the processes of resuscitation have improved markedly, and so it's possible now, for example, if somebody dies during the operation, cardiac operation, heart operations, if they die and they are right on the table, you can start resuscitating and they will come back. The problem is that when the cardiologists started doing that, about 20% of these people would come back and start telling them what they experienced when they were clinically dead, when there was no breath, no cardiac action, no brain activity on the electroencephalogram. And what these people have seen on operating table, for example, it was verified by other people who were in the operating room. Sometimes they actually moved and they had some experiences while clinically dead. They had some experiences in the building. Sometimes the consciousness went home and they could tell you exactly what their child or brother or wife had for dinner, what was happening at home. So, and they were verified by multiple observations. So, of course, if I tell that to my colleagues, they usually say, obviously they could not be dead. It's impossible. It could not have happened. But they should trust their cardiological colleagues who documented and published these observations. So this, and there are, of course, multiple other observations, fascinating observations about consciousness. But this one, I'm focusing on those areas that are experimentally well documented, but cannot be denied. So the other area that is not fitting in the concept of brain equals consciousness is.
Entonces, si quieres, quedamos a las 9:30, pero con posibilidad de margen, o si...
So, it's the psychic phenomena, psi phenomena, such as telepathy, remote healing, remote viewing, precognition, and so on. The only area, and they are well summarized, I have all the references, there's large books well, 2018, an American psychologist, Cardena, summarized all these studies and shows that they are these abilities are well documented as other psychological functions. There's a book by Charles Start, there is by Radin. These are things that are well summarized. But it is only remote viewing that I think has been sufficiently tested, that had enough funds, enough money in it for almost 30 years. And therefore, it has very solid, highly statistically significant findings showing that there is that direct information transfer is possible without the involvement of brain. What happened was that, again, in a summary, what happened was that the American army discovered, learned that Russians were using some psychic abilities to study American army, so they decided we have to do it too. And so they had two physicists who were interested in these experiments. And so for a number of years, they paid for these experiments in Stanford Research Institute. And what happens essentially is that they had a location, they were looking for some locations that are easy to identify, where there is something standing out, a tower, swimming pool, railway, something that would be easier to report. And they chose these 50 points, then randomly they chose one of them, and the one person would go to this location without the clairvoyant knowing where it is, and the clairvoyant would be sitting in the office, and when they arrived there, he would say, this is what the place looked like. The observations were collected. They were highly significant statistically. They were the president of American Statistical Association, Jessica Utz, analyzed the whole findings and the procedures and agreed that this was experimentally kosher. And so this is a psi phenomenon that you cannot explain by consciousness being hidden in the brain. They even tested, they tried to find out what the process is. They even they try to eliminate some electromagnetic possible transmissions. They did, let's say, send the beacon into the submarine, I don't know, 500 meters under the water, where the electromagnetic transmission is difficult, and they replicated the experiments again. So that's another body of information that cannot support the idea of brain being in the brain and consciousness being the same. And as I mentioned, there's Cardena's article, Dorsey's, Radin, Start's, Wabe, books that summarize the experiments about all the other psychic phenomena. But the most, for me, as in terms of proof, I think the remote viewing is probably the most solid one. And as I say, it's most solid because they were able to get sufficient money. It's very difficult to get any funds for psychic research. There is another interesting area that suggests that we cannot explain memory we cannot explain consciousness by brain, and that's body memory. again, there's a lot of observations that suggest that there's lots of storage in the tissues, actually. And again, that's one of the reasons why body work is so important, I think, when it comes to holotropic breath work or psychedelic-supported psychotherapy. There is one area that is undeniable, and that's heart transplants. Because what happens is when you transplant the heart from that person that was it was possible to fairly quickly obtain the heart, and the family agrees that it should be used, goes to the donor, and there are a number of independent observations showing that the donor actually starts showing some features, some personality features, some interests that the recipient actually had. And that's been documented by the families of the donor and the families of the recipient. And there's very substantial amount of observations about this because the heart transplants have become fairly common. So most of the time, the brain and the body works together usually, but in some circumstances, like heart transplants, they can operate separately. Finally, the other area that does not fit the brain-limited idea of consciousness is the research we did in neurobiology looking at severe depressions, melancholias, and manias. And the manic depressive illness, particularly the classical one, was very good target for these studies, because these people go through three states. They go through severe depression, they go through normal situation, and if the psychiatrist does not have the history, the patient doesn't have the history in the free interval, then you cannot identify there's anything wrong. And yet the next week or next month or next year, the person can go into severe mania. So we've studied these situations, and it obviously has some implications for what happens with consciousness. Now, you probably know what the severe clinical depression looks like, and if you have some memory of what I said about non-ordinary states, then you see that severe depression and severe mania certainly fit the descriptions of non-ordinary states of consciousness. And one is the most miserable experience that people describe. I've seen several patients who had the most painful physical experiences and other times depressions. And they said always, I would take anything else than the experience that my mind is completely out of control, that I feel everything is negative, the life feels completely purposeless, the time is slowing, and this is going very slowly, and of course there are self-destructive impulses. So this is a type, when it's severe, it's a type of non-ordinary state. Similarly, with mania, nice, good manic states have mystical states. The typical kind of manic states, I remember, always caused the problems because they would come to the hospital and I have gold watch, and I share it with everyone, and they would give away all that money, whatever they had valuable on them, because they were connected with everyone. And they said, why should I have it? Because the families were very unhappy about those situations. You didn't press it. But mania clearly is another type of non-ordinary state of consciousness. time feels speeded up. If you ask manic patients to tell you what's 10 seconds, they will, by 5, 6, 7 seconds, they will be done. And of course, you know stories, they all might also, the self can shift, and the self of a manic patient can shift into, depending on their preference, they could shift to Van Gogh or Mozart or presidents. So there's a self change. You would think that if consciousness is created in the brain, then these two extreme non-ordinary states of consciousness should show some different findings. And this is particularly reasonable expectation, because when you study these conditions, severe depression or mania, you actually find that every neurobiological indicator that we looked at and others looked at, and there's tens of thousands of studies on this, there are demonstrable neurobiological changes in the brain. I will primarily show you just the brain imaging because that's easy. You don't need interpretation. With all these other findings, you usually need to interpret properly the neurochemical changes and so on. But they are clearly demonstrable in all these areas, particularly in melancholy. Manic patients are more difficult to study. So you would think that if these conditions are like heaven and hell, and you have these changes in the brain, that they would somehow differentiate between these conditions. Well, but when you go through one after the other, there are changes, there are neurobiological differences, but they are indistinguishable between severe depressions and severe manias. For example, in both conditions, there is a marked increase of interconnectivity. The parts of the brain that normally are not connected start functioning together. And here there is an area, I don't know whether you can see my pointer. Can you see? No? Anyway, in the central parts of the brain, there is so-called default mode network, which is like a filter. And under normal circumstances, this filter can take through it up to about 2,000 impulses from the environment per second. On the other hand, when you are severely depressed or severely manic, this function stops working and the filter starts opening up, and you can get much more information from the outside. But it's a similar finding from all the studies that I've seen so far. It's the same. It's not yes, there may be differences in quantity, but the qualitatively it's the same. Just to show you, good studies have been done, particularly with psychedelics. You know, some individuals were receiving placebo and later receiving some psychedelic like psilocybin, and you can see how with normal, and this is magnetoelectroencephalography, you can see how the interconnectedness in the brain is hugely increased, and how the different parts that normally would not function with each other connect. And again, you know that you can have experiences that put together where you can hear, for example, what you're supposed to see, or you can see music in non-ordinary states of consciousness. So this is the neurobiological basis for that. And here is a brief summary of some of the things that we studied over the years. And you find in the brain marked changes in number of neurobiological measurements, whether it's neurohormones, whether it's neurotransmitters, whether it's some sodium or potassium changes and so on. But as you see, they are major changes in all of them, significant changes, but they are the same for each function. So I think it's reasonable to assume, but you can assume two things. You can say either, I think the response that I will probably get from most neurobiologists is, well, okay, there's no difference, but we'll find it. We'll eventually find it. There will be something. Yeah, the problem is that this has been the story for 60 years. Whenever any new technique comes, oh, we'll find the difference now. But of course, so I think it's time for start looking at other option, and that's that the experiences are not coming from the brain. They're coming from somewhere else. There are changes in the brain. They enable it, but the experiences are coming from somewhere else. And the last issue then is, does brain actually contribute something to the neural states? And in our observations, it comes to the conclusion that yes, what brain does, brain, first of all, creates propensity in the sense that some people are more likely to experience non-ordinary states of consciousness. Some people are more likely to go easier into non-ordinary states during holotropic breath work or during psychedelics, and there is a genetic component to it. About 3-4 years, we actually found some of the genes that are involved in at least in the classical manic depressive illness. It also influences the intensity and the timing. I think brain plays a role when you are more likely to have intense experience in breath work and when you are not. So the timing, those are the main things that brain contributes, I think, to the experience. This is a patient, we've followed a number of patients neuroendocrinologically, and it turns out that when the brain is working overtime, these are the periods where people are prone to having severe non-ordinary states of consciousness. And we've certainly seen that with illness, when they have manic depressive illness, but also when these people participated in holotropic breath work, these were the times of the peaks that their experiences were particularly intense, particularly strong. They need very little to get into non-ordinary states. And we also tested, and I'm not going to go into details, but classical manic depressive illness can be helped a great deal with lithium. And because it's episodic, we learned to identify the underlying rhythm and treated people only during the risk periods. And when they did not follow the instructions, forgot, traveled, didn't go back to the medication as they were supposed to go, they became ill again. And so there's a kind of a prospective confirmations of the fact that indeed there are periods of time where I'm much more prone to have non-ordinary states of consciousness and have them much more intense. So, to put it all together, I would say, first of all, clearly the idea that we are getting from mainstream science is that consciousness is created in the brain is at least incomplete, if not wrong. Based on all these findings of others and ours, it appears that the brain body on the one hand and some non-local field of consciousness that provides the experiences cooperate in the process. What seems to come from the brain is who are more predisposed and at what time they are predisposed. But the actual rich experiences that we end up having during non-early states, whether they are induced by holotropic breath work, whether they are induced by psychedelics, whether they are induced by conditions like depression or mania, the experiences seem to be coming from somewhere else, because in those states, the central filter, the default mode network it opens up, does not function normally, opens up and makes it possible to the fields of consciousness to pour into the system. This is clearly a rudimentary hypothesis. There's going to be much more to this story. But I think it's important to make this a hypothesis, because only then we can really start studying the richness of non-early states of consciousness. Study what determines actually what kind of processes we have. How do some archetypal situations, how measure expressed, for example, in planetary constellations as Zeitgeber's measure of time passing. We need to expand the idea, the underlying idea, and I think it's slowly coming up. And I think I was so surprised. I traveled with Stan in May in Central Europe, how the acceptance of, even in mainstream science, is opening up and realizing that the expanded map of consciousness that he discovered is real and well supported. So, very happy to answer any questions. It's a very short version of a long story, but I think that was that hopefully was of some interest.